Hi, everybody. I'm Ed Patuto. I'm Director of Audience Engagement here at the Broad, and I want to welcome you to Exhibiting Black Art in 1970s Los Angeles. Today's program is co-presented with LACMA, and we want to thank them for their support and encouragement on this program. For much of the programming for Soul of the Nation, the objective is to give voice to the people who were active in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and who were integral to the cultural and political environment that nurtured some of the most significant and influential artists of the era. In today's program, we've invited three cultural leaders who played pivotal roles in promoting emerging Black artists at a time when few museums or galleries would exhibit their work. Without their dedication and commitment, we could not have an exhibition like Soul of a Nation or Life Model, Charles White and His Students, which is curated by Ian White and is a companion show to LACMA's Charles White, a retrospective, which is on view at LACMA through June 9th. And I encourage you to see it if you haven't. It's an extraordinary exhibition. Ian White's exhibition is on view at the Charles White Elementary School, which is on Wilshire Boulevard, the old Otis campus, for those of you who remember Otis when it was downtown, through September 15th. These three exhibitions, along with the Underground Museum's Roy DeCarava, The Work of Art, CAM's Plumb Line, Charles White and the Contemporary, the Skirball Center's Black is Beautiful, the photography of Kwame Brathwaite, and Time is Running Out of Time at Art and Practice are giving Angelenos a rare opportunity to see the prolific work of some of the best yet most under-recognized artists of their time. This afternoon, the Broad's Associate Curator, Sarah Loyer, will be joined by Ian White, Suzanne Jackson, and Dale Brockman Davis to speak about this period in LA's history. So now, some about our panelists, and then I'll turn it over to them. Dale Brockman Davis is an artist, curator, and co-founder, along with his brother Alonzo, of the prominent Leimert Park-based Brockman Gallery. Brockman Gallery exhibited several of the artists in Soul of a Nation, including Betye Saar, David Hammons, John Outterbridge, Romare Bearden, Elizabeth Catlett, and Noah Purifoy. Dale's generous spirit led him to welcome artists into his home and provide them with studio space as well. Dale was a longtime arts teacher at Dorsey High School in South Los Angeles, and like Charles White, he too influenced several generations of aspiring young artists and fostered an awareness and appreciation of Black artists in Los Angeles during this period. Suzanne Jackson, I have to say I got exhausted reading Suzanne's bio because she's an extraordinary person and is so prolific. I encourage you to get to know her. She's a visual artist, a gallery owner, a poet, a dancer, and a set designer with a career spanning 5 decades. Her visual artwork has been exhibited internationally, including at the Studio Museum and the California African American Museum. On June 28th, Suzanne Jackson, 5 Decades, will open at the Telfair Museum in Savannah, Georgia. Suzanne founded the influential Gallery 32 in Los Angeles that was a hub for many of the artists in Soul of a Nation. Since the late 1960s, Suzanne has dedicated her life to studio art, yet she is active in theater, teaching, community life, and social activism. She has taught at Yale and San Francisco State Universities, and through her teaching, Suzanne has influenced generations of artists and built close-knit art communities in the many cities where she has lived. Since 1996, Suzanne has been active in many ways in Savannah, Georgia. Ian White. Ian is a Los Angeles-based artist and teacher whose visual practices includes narrative murals, abstract sculpture, and much more. Ian was greatly influenced by his father, Charles White, and the community of artists, musicians, actors, and activists in which he was raised. Ian recently completed a children's book, Grandpa and the Library, How Charles White Learned to Paint, for the exhibition Charles White, a retrospective at LACMA. In fall of this year, Ian and David Hammons will complete a book project on MoMA's 217 Artists' Choice exhibition, Charles White and Leonardo da Vinci, which Hammons curated. That exhibition had both work of Charles White alongside the work of da Vinci. And just to also mention, Hammons was also a student of Charles White. And lastly, my colleague Sarah Loyer, who will be moderating today's panel. She's the Associate Curator of Exhibitions and Exhibitions Manager at the Broad, where she has contributed to the museum's inaugural exhibition and subsequent collections exhibitions, including Creature, Oracle, and A Journey That Wasn't. She also worked on Cindy Sherman, Imitation of Life. And Sarah has been the Broad's curator for the traveling exhibitions Yayoi Kusama, Infinity Mirrors, and Soul of a Nation, Art in the Age of Black Power, 1963 to 1983, which is on view downstairs. Much of the great layout and kind of how the galleries are working downstairs is really Sarah's work. I think she did an extraordinary job on this. Sarah is also, just to mention, the co-curator of Time is Running Out of Time at Art and Practice. This exhibition was co-curated with Janelle Brown, and it is an exhibition that puts forth the early student work of the LA Rebellion filmmakers at UCLA, alongside the work of emerging visual artists. And I encourage you to spend some time with that exhibition as well. And so with that, I want to welcome our panelists to the stage, and thank you all again for coming out.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. I'm Sarah Loyer. I'm the Associate Curator and Exhibitions Manager here at the Broad, and I want to start by thanking Ian, Dale, and Suzanne for being here with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I think we're going to jump right in. Thank you, Ed, for that introduction, and I want to thank our partner, LACMA, for this program. Ian, you co-curated Life Model, Charles White and his students. And as part of that, you conducted several interviews with many different artists who were students of your father.
Yes.
And you made a video, and that video is on LACMA's website. Suzanne, you were interviewed for that video, and along with many other artists. So in that video, Gary Lloyd talked about key questions that Charles White would ask all of his students. The questions were, where do you come from? Why are you doing this? And how do you know who you are? These are really big questions. They demonstrate the kind of thinking that made Charles White a great artist and a great teacher. I'd like us to use these questions to frame our conversation today.
Wonderful.
When we think about your work in LA in the 60s and 70s. All right. So let's start with the first two. Where do you come from, and why are you doing this? So, Ian, you grew up here in LA, in Altadena.
Yes.
But your father wasn't from here originally. So when and why did your father move to LA? And can you talk about the multiple facets of Charles White's work as an artist and as a devoted mentor and teacher?
All right. Charles White does begin his livelihood in Chicago. And subsequently he goes to New York, and then his final years are here in Los Angeles. Plug to the retrospective that's at the LA County Museum. I hope you all get some time to go visit through June 9th. Also, as well as at the Charles White Elementary School, there is this former student show that's really amazing. I've been surrounded by these amazing students, former students of his, that are now embraced by the institution. You see a lot of them within the show, The Soul of the Nation. I'm the young one up here in the sense of I'm born in '65, right? But to put that in context, I used to say that I'm the luckiest county baby I know because I'm adopted, and my parents were of this interracial couple. I see my folks, my loving folks right here. And, you know, they didn't let folks adopt into the 60s, especially interracial couples. And so, you know, it's a very kind of embraced position. But we also just I came into a family of love that were there and were really interested in nurturing and cultivating young people. And it really also spoke to my father's contribution in terms of his gift to his former students. We're spoiled by them at this point. And I've been fortunate enough to work collaboratively with some of them as well, and come across these folks along that journey. So where does it begin? You know, I'm one of these art privileged individuals in terms I've been surrounded by art since day one. Not everybody really has that as an option. But it's also, you know, I'm the child of contributors. Not only my father, but my mother. Both of these are strong beings. And to come from that comes a certain kind of responsibility. And not everybody's able to deal with that. But I kind of embraced it and am fortunate in doing that. And it has provided me, oh my God, so much material in terms of, like, I run the Charles White Archives. I represent my father's artistic interest. That's a joy. That's also has its, you know, burdens and responsibilities. But in that process, I'm able to have these experiences and share, again, this level of information. My father, from his early times in Chicago, when they weren't able collectively when they were able collectively, they would put their money together and they would send one individual to take a formal class. That individual will come in turn back to the group and teach the lesson. And this goes back to the understanding of my father's early understanding that information should be democratized. Information is not for privilege. And that kind of sense of is ultimately why I'm here as well. Because there is a need to get this out. I mean, you know, this thing with the Getty that's happening, the new Getty Initiative, is an amazing thing where they're trying to really put together this archive of African American artists. That's tremendous. It's a tremendous undertaking. But the fact that they want to digitize it, and that speaks to that democratic approach to information, that's imperative to, you know, us kind of continuing this, what we hear, momentum of this moment. So it's just not a moment, that it becomes, you know, someone else is having a show, someone else is having a show, this, that, and the other. You know, we're in LA in this time right now. That's amazing. But we'll talk about that more.
Yeah, I think that getting at the democratization of information makes a lot of sense, thinking about your father's practice as both an artist and as an educator, that it was about sharing that knowledge and sharing that information. How about Dale? Will you tell us when you came to LA and how this sort of multi-pronged approach to your practice as both an artist and as running a gallery?
I came to Los Angeles in 1955, not realizing that the concept that I was living was part of the Great Migration. Family split up. My mother brought my brother and myself to Los Angeles on the train. So that was a very interesting experience as a 10-year-old to kind of see how large the world was. I was born in a small town, Tuskegee, and it's like being on a track ever since. Went to public school here, very local. I went to 6th Avenue Elementary School, I was first introduced to true multiculturalism. Half of my class in elementary school was Japanese. Then I went from there to Fauché, Dorsey High School, LACC, USC, and a temporary stop at UCLA in a graduate program. There are lots of details that overlap with Charles White. We were talking earlier about change of role. Alonzo and I had the privilege of being mentored by Charlie, Bill Paggio, Ruth Waddy, Samela Lewis, all very strong artists in themselves, and we were very young. We started the gallery really based on the fact that we had taken a road trip in a Volkswagen bug, across the United States, stopping only where we had family, because during that period of time, you didn't try to go to a hotel. You went and you stayed with family. And so we got a chance to see galleries and museums, mostly in predominantly African-American schools, and so we had a chance to really interact in a way that we were not to be the same. So we went across the South, and then the East Coast into New York, and then across, and then back. And during this period, we talked about the possibilities of opening a gallery. And one of the formative events that happened was based on Alonzo's interaction with his master teacher at Pepperdine. And this was Pepperdine, when Pepperdine was on Vermont. Most people, I don't know, there's a long range, or age range of people in the audience here. I would suspect that many of the young people have no idea that Pepperdine started in the black community. And he was told that he had better get a teaching credential because there were no opportunities for him as an artist. And so these were conversations that started very, very early in our lives, and we realized, okay, well, we can make a difference here. And I think part of the role that we took was based on the fact that we were from a small town and were isolated, but the fact that we had parents that were very progressive, and we moved forward from that point. We opened the gallery in 1967. We were both very young, and there's an advantage to doing things the way we did them young, because you don't know what's really in front of you. I was, excuse me, an undergraduate student at SC. I was 20. My brother was 24. He was working on a teaching credential at USC. And my life was challenged by the fact that I knew that I was involved in something that my current teachers / professors probably would be resentful of, knowing that I was an undergraduate student, but we were maintaining, pardon? We were maintaining a gallery that was to be a very formidable institution. So I'm an early bird kind of person, so I would take morning classes and open up the gallery somewhere between 12:30 and 1 o'clock so that we could have a credible business, and it worked. So I'll cut that part a little bit short and move on to Suzanne so we can share this time.
Well, my parents moved from St. Louis, Missouri in 1944. I was 9 months old, and we drove in one of those Buicks, big round Buicks, across country. And later I discovered we were part of that migration. It was World War II was happening at that time. My mother had two brothers who were in the Navy stationed by accident. Both of them were stationed at Treasure Island in San Francisco. That wasn't supposed to happen. So they must have told my parents about jobs in the shipyard in San Francisco. So my father drove us across country. I remember stopping in Donner Pass, and my dad went in and got some this beautiful pink jar of something that I thought was going to be wonderful, but it was Pepto-Bismol. I've never liked pink. But I do remember going across Donner Pass in that snow, and then we finally got to San Francisco, and at one point, I guess I thought I was Asian because my first birthday was celebrated during Chinese New Year, and I've always loved Chinese New Year. But my dad worked in the shipyard at Hunters Point as an electrician. I didn't know that until he passed away. My mother worked for Curator of California, and a lot of the women who came across country worked in the textile mills and worked in the clothing industry while the men were working at the shipyard. When the war ended, my dad drove the cable cars and trolley cars in San Francisco, and I was able to ride with my dad on the trolley all the way up to Coit Tower. It's that tower that's there. I didn't realize till later, I was probably influenced by seeing those murals in Coit Tower, and also the trolleys, the cable cars and the trolley would go by the Sergeant Johnson murals that were in the building. The WPA art in San Francisco was just everywhere, in the post offices and everywhere. My dad would also photograph me in front of every monument and every building in San Francisco. I think he really was interested in architecture. At a certain point, my dad decided to go to Guam. My mother said, I'd rather you go to Alaska than Guam. So 3 weeks later, he came and he said, we're going to Alaska, or he was going to Alaska. So he worked for a private company finishing the Alcan Highway, which was also known as the Steese Highway. During World War II, actually the African-American soldiers were part of building the highway that went through Canada to Alaska up to Fairbanks. So I grew up in Fairbanks, Alaska, in an environment where we were encouraged. No one ever told me that I could not do what I wanted to do. We're working on my 5-decade retrospective now, and I found drawings that my mother had me working from observation in San Francisco, pictures of the Bay Bridge and Treasure Island in the middle. I couldn't have been more than 3 or 4 drawing these things. So for my whole life, knowing to draw from observation, and then I was in a fashion show at 5, and I have a drawing that I did of the stage, with me on the stage and the people sitting in the audience. This comes back later when I ended up going to grad school and studying scenic design, and that's exactly the way we were supposed to do some of our set designs. Well, anyway, coming from Alaska to college, I came down to San Francisco to study painting, and also because I wanted to be a part of that bohemian atmosphere with the jazz and music and art, and because San Francisco is so beautiful. But eventually, when I graduated from college, I was hired. I studied ballet. I was a ballet dancer studying with Pacific Ballet Company, and also studying at San Francisco State. We could take all the classes we wanted. Tuition was so low, it was incredible. So my last year of college, I auditioned for Sacramento Music Circus and performed in 2 musicals there, and that company toured South America, 11 Mexico and South America. While I was in South America, I found a brochure in French that talked about, I can't remember, there was 6 or 10 Negro artists, and there was Barbara Chase Riboud, Charles White, Norman Lewis, Critchfield. There was a group of incredible artists. I'd never seen anything like that because I didn't know that artists were separated by color. When I grew up in Alaska, most of the people there are mixed with Native or Russian or some other culture. So people didn't appreciate overt racism. So I didn't grow up in that kind of environment. So then when I came back from South America, I moved to Los Angeles, getting away from home with the advice of friends. Turns out the first person I met was Mel Edwards' sister, Ann Neal, at that time. And I was living in Echo Park. The next person I met was Alonzo Davis, who was looking at artwork of an artist named Robert Gore, who was moving his family to Spain. I didn't realize that Alonzo had a gallery then. I had no intention of having a gallery. I actually found a studio in a storefront through a rabbit hole underground on Temple Street. That was my first studio, and $40 a month for that studio. And then moved to a building near a house on Leimert Park. That was being sold, so I actually had to live in a motel with a dog and a cat until I found a space. But I was told, you should take class from Charles White. And I already had a degree, a BA degree in art, and I wasn't interested in studying full-time at Otis. But I took a class from Charles White and in drawing, and a class from Noel Quinn in watercolor. And Ian found a watercolor that I did during that period, which surprised me. I thought, what a lovely watercolor, but it was mine in the show, sorry. But one of the things, I like that watercolor. It was really beautiful when I saw it at the beginning of the month. One of the things that I really appreciated about studying with Charles White was that although I had been through 4.5 years of studying painting, we had critiques, but none of the teachers were all professional artists. They would go off and do their work at San Francisco State, come back for a crit, and then we wouldn't see them anymore. Charles White was the first teacher who actually talked to me, spoke with me in class about my work, because women weren't taken seriously at that time. And he sincerely was interested in my drawing. And then I only took one class from him, but he also, by that time I also found a space. I was looking for studio space, and that was what became Gallery 32. It was supposed to be my studio, but Charles White would come around and see the exhibitions because it was around the corner from Otis. And in a sense, I feel as if I had a lifetime of mentoring from Charles White, and we all did. And that's kind of a brief, quickly, I think that's enough. Okay, rough.
Yeah, I think that's good. Yeah, so in the exhibition downstairs in Soul of a Nation, there's one gallery that looks at LACMA's 1971 exhibition, 3 graphic artists, that came about in part in response to the efforts of the Black Arts Council. Cecil Ferguson and Claude Booker, who started the Black Arts Council. So I'd like us to talk a little bit about artist-led activism in LA in the 60s and 70s. So the Black Artists Association, so in addition to the Black Arts Council, Dale, you had shared a document with me before this talk that was from what was called the Organization of the Concerned Citizens of Black Art. And it was signed by the Black Arts Council, the Committee for the Encouragement of Afro-American Art, Gallery 32, Brockman Gallery, the Black Artists Association, Art West, and on and on and on. So just thinking a little bit more, can you talk about these sort of different entities and maybe some of the shared goals, and then maybe some of the ways that these different organizations functioned separately?
I can't address how the different organizations function separately because I was too involved in managing and running the gallery, teaching full-time high school, producing art on my own. And so, it took a lot. But, those are the kinds of things that you do as a young person who's motivated to succeed and to try new things. You have to look at the period of time and the fact that this was a growth period for activism within the United States. And so, excuse me, one of the fine points was that we had multiple organizations all focused on lifting up people of color. So, for example, you had the Black Artists Association, which was a group that I was a part of, which was run by Ruth Waddy. But you also had the Black Arts Council and the involvement of Cecil Ferguson, Claude Booker. if you think about other organizations or the number of organizations all trying to lift up the race, you'd realize that you have the same kind of tension that you have now. So if you looked at the fact that we had CORE, Congress of Racial Equality, you had NAACP, you had SNCC, you had Black Panthers, you know, the list was incredible because the need was so incredible, not that it's not now, continuing. So there was tension because everybody wanted to have a marked place in time and trying to influence the culture. So there's a lot going on, definitely a lot going on. One of the interesting things that happened based on this incredible period was when the 3 graphic artists exhibit opened, Alonzo and I in particular were part of, you know, a group that was shunned because we were promoting Charles White, David Hammons, Timothy Washington. And the community was looking at us like we had sold out for those 3 artists. But that was the beginning of major movement that has culminated really in this exhibit Soul of a Nation that's going on now. So, you know, you had to stand your ground. There were people who did not like the fact that we showed artists that dealt with abstracts. Everyone wanted the influence. A lot of tension, a lot of jealousy. One of the reasons that we were able to succeed for as long as we did at Brockman is because we were basically a 2-person team, and decisions were made on site, and you'd run with it. Alonzo and I both also agreed that, you know, as we decided that we were tired of it or wanted to do something different, you had to have 2 yes votes to quit. So if one person, really, it's serious. So if one person was sick of it, and the other person said, you know what, let's keep going, we would go on, you know, as part of the brotherhood. We, as kind of back information in history, my family on my mother's side worked as a team. And we learned, we referred to the aunts in the family, there were 7 of them, as the girls. And if you were born in late 1800s, early 1900s, in a small town, significantly Anniston, Alabama, you couldn't move out of town as a single woman. Because you would be referred to as, you can pick your name. So they would move out. They were all strong women. They would move out in teams, 2 and 2 and 2, right? And sometimes it would be an extra one. So we learned family from a different point of view. And we beat the odds in our relationship based on the women in our lives. In that basically men don't work together. Brothers don't work together. They compete. And so we were fortunate to have that kind of influence in our lives, and we were able to maintain the gallery for almost 20 years.
It's interesting because we were talking about us sort of being migratory people arriving in Los Angeles at a similar time. And although I was an only child of older parents who actually left family in St. Louis and moved all the way across country, then moved all the way up to Alaska, I watched my parents, and the parental influence was very strong, I think, for both of us, because my parents actually would start a business. That was part of survival. I never knew anything except that you were supposed to do things on your own and begin. When I moved into the studio, and David Hammons and Timothy Washington were trying to tell me to make my studio a gallery, and I'm saying, this is a studio. I don't want a gallery. This is not, what is that all about? My mother said to my dad, you need to go down there and check her out because I don't think she knows what she's doing. And by the time he arrived, I had already, the only thing that needed to be done was to sand the floors. I'd already got the lights and everything in. But actually, in the beginning, the first show was Timothy Washington, a friend from school in San Francisco, David Swanson, who was an abstract painter, and a jeweler from Santa Barbara. So it was a mixed group of, I didn't know there was any such thing as a black gallery. Someone told me, don't open a black gallery. And I said, well, what is that? And so basically, and I think the same thing happened at Brockman. There were artists not everyone was an African-American artist who showed there. We looked for quality work. That's one of the things that Charles White really emphasized, that even though we worked for social change in the community, and that as an artist you had responsibility in your work through the quality of your work, through the way you executed that work and presented it to make an influence in the community. I grew up with that as a discipline in the school that I attended in Alaska, and from my parents, watching them in their businesses. My parents, I thought about it, they had a barbecue restaurant in St. Louis. They moved to San Francisco, they had Susie's Barbecue when I was a baby. And then they moved to Alaska and they had a barbecue restaurant there, or a restaurant. They moved back again, they had a candy store, a restaurant, and my father had a real estate office. So I'd always seen people who started just as a matter of survival and business doing what they had to do. And no one ever told you you couldn't do something. You had to do it well, whatever you decided to do. I think one of the wonderful things about working with Brockman, when I look through all of the history of us, we worked together, all of these organizations as well. And I remember Ruth Whitey and the artist group, I think about meeting, and I can't remember her name, at the Mafundi Institute. And actually here in the 1950s, there were organizations that were starting these small groups. And then somehow when people found out by word of mouth that there was Brockman and that there were exhibitions at my gallery, then people just started coming in. Artists would come in and show their work and say, well, can I have a show? And I really in the beginning had no idea what was going to be next. And then all of a sudden, incredible people like Dan Conchalar came through with his work. David Hammons would come through and just put a piece up and take it down. And we became organized because of the artists who would come in and install their work and then invite their friends and invite other people from the community. One of the things that I was just reading recently was about right after the rebellion in Watts, a number of people from Hollywood came in to help Bud Schulberg with the Watts Writers Workshop. So writing and theater, as well as the visual arts, were happening in pockets around Los Angeles, and then people came together as community. Marguerite Ray was one of my early collectors. She and I auditioned for a part in San Francisco, the same part of the ballerina in Deflator Mouse. And then she was here, and through Betye Saar, she came to the gallery. So word of mouth through the different organizations, and we all supported one another. That's the way I remember it, that even though there were differences of opinion about how things should be done, I just remember it as a really big family of people with different ideas and sometimes combative, but really trying to work to the same goal for the community.
Ian, can you talk a little bit about your father's relationship to some of the important folks working in Hollywood who are also taking on some of these issues?
Yeah, hence on the set of The Defiant Ones that was filmed in Altadena, Sidney Poitier, Charles White, Ivan Dixon, who was Sidney Poitier's double, and Tony Curtis. It's Ivan going down that river and dislocating his shoulder. But even a little bit going back to what Dale was talking about, because some of my father's foundation is not necessarily in these different pockets of activism when he comes to California in '56. This film happens in '58. But it goes back to early groups in Chicago and New York. The Committee for the Negro of the Arts leaps to this photograph. And that's when you have these collective of these creative people really creating this dynamic of being able to support each other, not just visual artists. Most of my father's friends were musicians, writers, poets, theater people. that spoke of this whole kind of creative community. And you really needed support to continue that level of independent kind of growth. You needed this collective momentum. And I think that's what happens along with Gallery 32, with Brockman Gallery, and the numerous different other kind of groups that are forming. You may not be able to mine them individually, and rightfully so, but collectively, it is this momentum that happens. And this goes to my father living on Riverside Drive with Sidney Poitier and Harry Belafonte before any of them are anybody. And my father is their senior. I've mentioned before, as the story goes, they borrow his record player. But what happens is when my father and mother come out to California, and it's primarily for health reasons, because my father could not take the brutal winters of New York. He acquired tuberculosis in World War II, so he lost a lung. And he needed this more temperate climate. And by being here, he was able to kind of get into this Hollywood thing a little bit. He had already had these relationships with musicians, a great deal, because New York was that scene, right? And he was doing album covers out of the 50s to make a living. But when he got here, he was also able to go into this kind of Hollywood dynamic a little bit. And this is kind of an early photograph, which is very enduring, because I ended up growing up around these gentlemen here. And when we talk about this level of privilege, to see that things are possible, that, you know, the bar is high, but you can do anything. And, you know, it's really up to you, a matter in terms of your own personal convictions. But subsequently, you will see Charles White's images in Poitier's films. This is '58 when Belafonte has this television program. And if you made it to MoMA and saw the retrospective there, you heard Belafonte bellowing over the galleries because of my father's relationship to his television program, Evening with Belafonte, that would feature my father's work. So when he's in California, jumping back to California, when you watch Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, when they're in Spencer Tracy's study, you see a Charles White woodcut, lino cut, and it's called The Folk Singer, and it's Belafonte. So they would merge together in these different kind of venues. And subsequently in some other films as well, The Love of Ivy. There's a few of them where you see these Charles White works that appear. But it's also them mining the visual arts community as well, and engaging them within this other kind of artistic kind of genre. And that's very important, that kind of crossover that was happening. My father was illustrating books and so forth as well. And so that got him into this other kind of relationship. There you go, Carlton Moss. If you don't know Carlton Moss, you need to Google this man. He's an amazing filmmaker. He passed in '97. And I'm jumping ahead just because I see him, oops. It's heartfelt. When I was a kid, we used to have these little 8mm films that they would show, and they would be like on Paul Laurence Dunbar, on Langston Hughes. It was Carlton Moss that was making those. And his filmmaking kind of came out of World War II as well, because he was good friends with Frank Capra, the director. Carlton Moss did the first, what was it? Oh, gosh. It'll come to me in a second. But he goes on to do, he is the black in Hollywood in the 50s that you never hear about. He did The Negro Soldier, that's what I was trying to remember. He's the orator of that. He's a gentleman that's been overlooked for too long. His contribution to numerous different forms of having, again, former students using his own kind of skill set, using his own kind of trajectory as learning tools, influences a tremendous amount of cinematographers and young filmmakers. So going back to Charles White's kind of relationship to filmmaking, these cats were tight. I used to enjoy just answering the phone when Mr. Moss would call. And he'd keep you on point too. He used to call, he used to say, "What's happening in the future? What you doing?" Oh my God, try to come to terms with that. But it was a really encouraging thing. And I find the need to do that. I teach and I'm always so optimistic of the possibilities of what one can achieve. And they benefited by having this very tight-knit collective community that we should all kind of be mindful of in terms of how we approach and how we share information.
I think because I grew up in visual arts, I think from the time I was a baby, I knew I was going to be a painter, but I wanted to become a dancer, I wanted to be a model, I wanted to do all these things. I worked in theater. But when I moved here, even in the later 70s, when we had a fundraiser for Just Above Midtown at my studio, it was the young actors who came so they could be seen with us visual artists. And I remember Famous Amos would come around to every party. He would drop off a bag of cookies because he'd worked for the ad agency before he had his cookies. And his sons, they had a little shop on Hollywood Boulevard or Sunset, probably smaller than the stage, and the boys would be in there making cookies, his sons, and making them by hand. And then, but it was so great that he'd come to these parties, and then the actors would come. So for me, working in several fields in the arts, I never saw a separation of those. And I think, those three things you were saying that Charles White expected of who are we? And I've been asking those questions all my life because I was curious, like, who was my dad's family? Who was, as an only child and growing up out of the country, you want to know who you are. And then coming to Los Angeles, I met my family and friends here, but I still felt a little bit outside of things for some reason as an only child. But bringing theater people, bringing people in music, for me, I can't see a separation of arts. There was a time when people said you could only be a painter or a sculptor, or why are you in all of these activities? I think culturally, we're part of all of those activities as one. I don't see a separation. We had Gallery 32, Eileen Abdul-Rashid, who was Senga Nguti's cousin, invited the players from, I think, Rojo and his group, the Malcolm X Center, came out, they played, there was spoken word and poetry before we called it rap, I think. And so that was a combination of, and at Brockman, Leimert Park was there, and there were incredible musicians who were playing out in the park, and that was a part of our visual aspects as well. Just all the arts working together and joining together was very important, I think.
Maybe that's a good transition to talk about some of the Brockman Gallery Productions work, the nonprofit work that you did in the community.
About 2 years into Brockman Gallery, because of this kind of networking process that was going on, we were able to collectivize and have a nonprofit that most people don't know about. It was called Brockman Gallery Productions. And so at this point, we have widened the view, the perspective, the sources of information, the skill sets that were there that you could not do as an individual or small group. Because of productions, we were able to do the Olympic mural projects. Most people don't realize where that came from. A lot of this depends on your age, and it depends on your skill set in terms of researching what has happened. At this point, I would like the audience to know that Brockman Gallery now is part of the Los Angeles Public Library archive. Thank you. In the archive, because I received a grant through Art and Practice, and it's interesting that that came about because I wrote a small complimentary note to Mark Bradford when he received his was it Guggenheim MacArthur Foundation Award, and he was living in with the same address number, one street away from the address of Brockman Gallery. And I thought, wow, how neat. Put a note in his door, left it. He contacted me. We talked. I invited him to the house. He came by. He had so much information. I was so surprised because as a child, he used to walk by Brockman and look in the window and realize, oh, wow, these guys, I don't know who they are, but they have black people. There are black people in the window, right? Another point that comes up to mind is the fact that most people didn't realize that Brockman had a much wider perspective. We were thought to be a black gallery, right? But we were a multicultural gallery space focusing on African American artists. And so that, that crosses over to the productions and the murals, and we had, when the library finally they don't have to re-archive it, but they have to redo their source to make it available to the public. Catalog it, right? It's in form. That's because of Art in Practice. But it's in form. So you might have to, if you're really interested in doing the research, you might have to give them a little more time. But it's incredible the amount of information that's there and the crossover that happened. We had festivals in the park, Leimert Park, looking very different than the Leimert Park if you know the area that exists now. Art in the park, yoga in the park, black film festivals, before CAM was in the building it's in now. It's back to that kind of shotgun effect where we were doing a lot of things with a lot of other people. Communicative Arts Academy with John Outterbridge. There's certain names that will continue to come up. John Riddle, Outterbridge, Samela Lewis. It goes on and on and on. And the influence that they have had on the culture of LA. A piece that I'm very proud of in relationship to the archive and the history of Brockman is the fact that Soul of a Nation is using the image of Elizabeth Catlett's work, Unity, which is a red mahogany carving with a fist and two faces on the opposite side. As part of this credit basis and just as part of the history so that you know that particular art piece, because it's so important to know that, we weren't making any money. No. This was a contribution. This was a nonprofit, okay, in a different sense, okay, in all senses, right? So Alonzo and I realized that, it's very disappointing to have a major exhibit with a major artist with major talent and sell one piece or no piece. So we decided that we would take it on as a personal commitment to purchase work from every show, right? And we had something that, once again, it depends on when you were born, we had a layaway plan. Okay? Those that aren't laughing, look it up. Look it up, or ask your parents, right? So you could actually buy art on time, right? Including Alonzo and myself. So, we were fortunate enough that, we were making money as teachers. So one of the most interesting things to me in relationship to Soul of a Nation is the fact that this image is represented here by Brockman Gallery because we own this piece. And this piece was recently purchased. And so to realize that the Broad has taken this on as an identity piece is very significant. So those of you that are going to do further research about Brockman, you'll see that there's a lot of history. It covers a lot of territory. I did want to add one more thing. I know our time is moving on. In 1969, we had a major exhibit that was sponsored by the National Council of Jewish Women. And it was a major exhibit, and we must have had 30, 40 artists. And if you look at the list of names of artists that produced work for that show, you realize, and I was surprised because I had to go back and look at it, that there probably are 10 or 15 names that are either Japanese or Korean, as well as the new name now for Mexican Americans, Latinx, right? So it's been a collective, and it's been influential, and I'm proud to say that this is part of what we were about.
There's that list.
And there's the list.
Yeah.
There's the list, right.
Different
Okay,
show.
a
Oh.
different show, different show. So
Different,
it's part of this history and this basis, which is why we're sitting here together. And it's so much fun that we all know each other and that we're all artists, because so often in an environment like this, they're all art historians, which will have a different point of view.
I have to say, I'm living on the other side of the country now in Savannah, Georgia, which is another cultural experience altogether. But I read everything and try to keep up with what's going on. The murals along Crenshaw, on that wall, the first murals, I think I did one, and Dan Conchalar, David may have done one, Timothy, and now I'm reading that that's going to be a sculpture. That was part of the Brockman Gallery's, initiated that. But also, I was the artist coordinator for the Comprehensive Employment Training Act, CETA. These are the artists in my group, the first group. There was Kent Twitchell, there was Joan DeBruin, Audubon Lucas, Sanga Nangudi. Let's see, who else was in that group? And then Roberto Delgado, and then Hiroshima. The group was, the music group had got their start. I went out searching. I've got their albums, those early albums, in my collection, because that was a very exciting time where we overlapped. It was in the Ankrum Gallery. I didn't really show at Gallery 32. I was represented by Ankrum Gallery on La Cienega. Charles White was represented by Heritage Gallery across the street. Ankrum Gallery and Heritage showed many artists of various colors, all along without, racism. They just showed artists according to quality. Joan Ankrum, in her donating her archive to the Smithsonian, I was shocked to find out how she had actually kept, I always sent all the announcements, all the letters. She has a history of every exhibition from Brockman, from all the galleries and artists who showed here in Los Angeles. And it's just an incredible archive. We're working on my five-decade retrospective now. So I'm finding out things about myself that I'd forgotten even. But we always think galleries are very disorganized, they don't take care of things. But seeing how Joan Ankrum actually archived every brochure, every announcement for Northern California, Southern California, all of the artists' brochures that were sent to her are in the Smithsonian, in the American Archive of American Art. So that's something you can also look up to find out about what happened in the galleries here.
And Suzanne, so Gallery 32 operated just for a short time, a couple of years.
Yes, because I was really doing it by myself. I always thought how fortunate they had brothers. I always wanted brothers and sisters. I wanted to be triplets, but I couldn't do that. So basically, I started the gallery because I was teaching first and second grade at 95th Street School, and I was doing morning shift from 7:30 till 11:30. And just as Dale was mentioning, they'd open the gallery in the afternoon. I would open Gallery 32 from 1 until 7 in the evening, and doing that double shift. But at a certain point, I decided I was supposed to be a painter, and I didn't want to teach. I was 6 hours away from getting a teacher's credential, and I just decided I didn't want to take that risk. I wanted to be an artist. So I was running Gallery 32 on a hair, and also traded We printed the brochures in one color paper with maybe a color ink. And fortunately, the printer around the corner was really nice, and he worked with us to do that. But if an artist didn't sell any work, I would also sort of make a trade for maybe the cost of postage and that came out of my pocket. But as you said, we made no money. We really did it from the passion, I think, that came from Charles White being exposed to him, because it was somehow in his spirit and passion, and it stayed with me all my life since then. And I had a part of that from my family and the way that I grew up, in Alaska, where people have to survive. And you don't give up, you keep going. And I always say, when people think I've disappeared, I pop up again, and with something else that's happening. The image that just showed with John Stinson in the mail truck, city officials came. The gallery, the balconies in the Granada building were lined up with people coming from all over. That was just an accident. That photo was taken by Bob Hellerton, who I would really love to get his archive or get into it. It's not released yet. Have you been able to get any photos? Because he took photos of all the artwork that was going on, the murals. When I was working on my mural on Venice and Western, he was there photographing that, and we haven't been able to get those. He passed away just before we did the Gallery 32 in its circle exhibition at Loyola Marymount. And this is one of those beautiful images that he took. And as you see, it was on blue paper with black ink. But it actually pulled people in, because you're seeing this mailman is actually an artist. And the work that John was doing then were these delicate, beautiful, tiny pieces that you'd think, okay, this guy's going to make great big work, but very delicate, and it's one of the shows that I think we did sell work, and Dan Conchalar was another that we sold enough to pay expenses. And when you consider in those days, the rent for Gallery 32 was $150 a month, but it was still a struggle to be able to pay the rent, to pay the postage at 6 cents was quite a struggle. But we did it because we had to. Yeah.
And I wanted to point out also that when you were the CETA coordinator, that was with Brockman. So you moved to San Francisco, and then you came back and worked.
Well,
with
when I
Dylan
closed
Alonzo.
Gallery 32, I was married at the end of Gallery 32, and it was just, I couldn't do anymore. It was just, I'd run out of money, run out of everything. And I really wanted to paint, really get back to full-time painting. And after being married, pollen, a short time, I was pregnant, and life changes. Well, this is one of those issues that I have. You see a lot of the male artists are they're in the forefront, and even with the Black Arts Council, a lot of the wives were taking care of kids, supporting the men who were really the core of the Black Arts Council. And there was a lot of struggle for families at that time. The amount of time that the people who were working on the Black Arts Council and a lot of these arts groups were spending really trying to get exhibitions out, putting them anywhere, whether they were in schools, on the street corner, wherever, in churches. It was taking a lot of toll on families at that time. I'm telling you that because the women were actually holding up a lot of these, a lot of the men who were putting themselves at risk by putting the art out there. But as a woman, as a mother, I moved to San Francisco, and then E.J. Montgomery was working at the Oakland Museum curating a show called Black Untitled Dimensions of the Figure. So as soon as I arrived in San Francisco, I was asked to be in that exhibition. I was fortunate because I arrived in Los Angeles not knowing anyone, and I think it was Malcolm Lubliner who told me about Charles White, and he told me about the Watts Festival, put a painting in. So I put paintings in, I met people. Then we got to be in the show at Laguna Beach Art Museum. And then moving back to San Francisco, being fortunate again as an artist to be in the show at the Oakland Museum. And then for me, The creative spirit came right after my son was born. I published a book of poetry and paintings. And so there's another aspect of how women work in the arts and also the imagery. I remember Senga Nguda on the Cedar Project attempting to hang some of her stretched nylons on the top of a building on the corner of Western and Adams, I forget where that corner was. And there was this huge grid that normally would, I guess, neon signs would be on. And everybody thought Senga was crazy, absolutely crazy. And you see the elegant work that she has produced, since then, very quietly with her, really quiet spirit. So I'm still champion women in a sense because women aren't getting the same recognition as the men. We hear the same names over and over again. One of the things we also did, the art, those of us who were being asked to show often because we were the only names that people recognized or knew because we had been shown, we all decided to choose at least 5 other artists that we knew so that when we were invited to exhibit, we could at least recommend other artists in the community that we knew of. And I'm really sort of still very adamant about that. It's like there are so many artists, and at the Charles White exhibition, the reception, there were so many artists there that I hadn't seen in 50 years. And some of those artists have been forgotten. They live right here in the community. I hadn't seen Marion Epting in such a long time, Marvin Hardin. There were a lot of artists that really strong, very good, that were featured even in Samela Lewis and Ruth Waddy's books, Black Artist on Art. And
Charles White Elementary School.
and they are now at the Charles White Elementary School. It's an incredible exhibition that really shows the body of so many artists who were here, of all colors, actually.
What you're saying is reminding me, I think the first time I met you, you told me often when we think about this 3 graphic artists show and when we look at that history, we remember that there was criticism of that show because people said, Charles White at that time was a very accomplished artist and he deserved a solo show. But you told me that the opposite side of that is when Charles White would be invited to exhibit his work, he would say, I'll do that as long as you allow me to bring these people with me, these other artists with me.
That's right.
Can you all talk a little bit about that?
My first solo show was at University of Pacific, curated by Larry Walker. He held another exhibition that was Charles White, Bill Pajo, and me in that exhibition. I am quite sure to this day that Charles White, and actually I'd met Bill Pajo through, I worked at the post office in San Francisco, and then I transferred to Los Angeles in the post office. And I remember this post office here had more Black people than I'd ever seen in my life in one place, right? But but it turned out that one of the fellows working there was named Smitty, he was the other Black person in Ivan Dixon's film, Hogan's Heroes?
Right,
Yes.
right.
He took me to meet, I was this little girl, and he took me to meet these other artists. And they were playing cards, and it was Bill Pajo and I think Howard Moorhead, and I don't know who the other person was. And they kind of looked at me and said, oh yeah, hi, you're in your mini skirt and we're sure you're, an artist. They didn't take me seriously. So for me, it felt, I was really privileged to have, and I'm sure Charles White said, invite her to be in this exhibition with me and Bill Pajo and then also the 3 graphic artists. And when there was this talk at the museum with John Riddle, Charles White always recommended other artists to come along, to be a part of that. And I think that's what we learned. You bring along the community, you bring them with you. And that includes musicians and poets. If you're an artist and you're having an exhibition, include your family of other artists, and that way we support one another. We are all arts, together.
Dale, can you talk about that relationship with Charles White and his mentorship to you?
When you talk to Charlie, you knew that all you could do was listen. He was that kind of man. And I have a vivid memory of sitting on the steps. He was on the steps with Bill Paggio, and Alonzo and I were downstairs. And all you could do was listen and take notes. And he would outline exactly, through questioning. Do you have this? Do you have invoices? Have you figured out your proportion ratio for sales? And, this was early. We were just really starting. And so we knew how serious it was just speaking with him, and that it was a very serious matter. And then buffeted by that was the fact that when Alonzo and I thought about the possibility of opening the gallery, we had a roundtable discussion with my mother and my Aunt Louise, the two sisters that grew together and moved to LA and lived together. Their view was, you need to go to graduate school and you need to go to business school before you open this gallery. We had already had enough of school. Right? And so all we could think about was, no, yes, that's right. I mean, that's good. But no. We have to do this and we have to do this now. And even though, they threw down the gauntlet of what we needed to do and how to be prepared for it, they worked with us hand in hand throughout this whole process. And because of it, and the fact that they were both librarians, my mother was a librarian with the city, and my aunt was a librarian with the county. They brought in their group of workers and people, and so we would include, it was like an all-inclusive kind of thing. So if you happen to be part of a sorority and you were a black librarian, you would have your meetings at the gallery. And so that was the beginning of understanding how to collectivize on a good idea. We would have, because I was teaching also at the same time, my idea was, okay, well, when we have a UTLA meeting, which was a union meeting, we didn't want to have it at the school site because we didn't know who was on our side, and you know how that thing goes. It's political. We would have meetings at the gallery. We would have Friday events with wine and come by. So the whole idea was to build an audience, keep the audience involved, relate to any and everybody in the community. So really, to have had the influence of these older men and women was critical to our success. And I was speaking to our team that's here now, and realizing that at our age in particular, we are now in the exact role and position that our mentors were when we passed the torch, right? Then they passed the torch to us. And you're younger.
Thank you.
And we're passing, and we're still holding the torch. We're keeping it lit, but it's more, your responsibility now, and the younger people that as part of your influence group. And to compliment you, I am very proud of you and what you have done through your dad's name and your mom's influence. And thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate that.
These are my role models, right? I mean, you can't, that photograph, I constantly see these former students. And my father used to do this thing where at the end of each semester, they would come to the house. And it was just kind of amazing to see these people, again, along with this other kind of creative community. This is why I became a visual artist, because they seemed to know more about everything. They were more informed, generally speaking, could talk basically about anything, and really sound convincing as well because of the level of conviction that they would have around it. So it really didn't matter the topic, right? And I'm mindful of the Ivan Dixon yet again, as you brought him up, and he's in the photograph here, because he fits right in line with the soul of the nation. Now, if you don't know that he did The Spook That Sat by the Door, he did Nothing But a Man. He is the director in terms of television drama that nobody knows about. He does more Magnum PIs than anybody. He directs the A-Team, the Rockford Files, Charlie's Angels, the Waltons. I mean, that's dating a little bit, the Waltons. But, you know, and Frances Williams was the grandmother. If anybody in here remembers Frances Williams, who actually had the alternative theater space for folks to participate. And you would be able to go in and see professional actors in this woman's garage conversion present thematic, dramatic, heartfelt, amazing short theater. So anyways, this is really a wonderful kind of picture.
Another person that shouldn't be forgotten is Jackson from the Cultural Center.
C. Bernard Jackson.
C. Bernard Jackson. For me, when I was 19, I was in a musical called Fly Blackbird in San Francisco. And I was the dancer. I ended up being the choreographer and doing costumes. When you're a visual artist, if you can sew, sometimes you end up doing the costumes. I ended up coming back after grad school, and I was working regional theater all across the country. Mark Taper, Ivar Theater with C. Bernard Jackson. They were doing Fly Blackbird again with the students from the Performing Arts School. And I kept wondering, they were rewriting and rewriting. Why is they rewriting this? I didn't realize that C. Bernard was the original writer of Fly Blackbird with Camille Billups' husband, Hatch. And here I was coming back in my 50s, working on a show with this man that I had known here with the Cultural Center. Roberto Delgado painted the mural, and Dan Conchalar on the Cultural Center. And so here I'd been living here all this time, and then coming back later as a costume designer with the performing arts students. And when C. Bernard walked on stage, those students lit up. They loved him. And this is part of what I'm talking about in that combination of the visual arts, theater, poetry, and working with young people. So as a young artist, I performed in that play, and then coming back again and seeing this next generation, working with him where he had rewritten some things from the first time. That was very exciting for me, and it was kind of made me cry as well to realize that something was being reworked that I'd been in when it was, an early production by someone that I'd known for a long time. Sometimes we don't know who people are who are right in our midst, and I think, you're really fortunate to be in Los Angeles, where this history is quite incredible. Some of the early artists who worked together. And I do remember actors, as they would do a little bit better, get the next show, and the next show would come into the gallery, buy a piece of art, then they'd come back when they got the next show, made a little more money, and bought more work from artists.
I think that's a great moment to think about for our last question, which I'm going to go back to. This is our last question, then we're going to open up for questions. So it's going to be quite a challenge, because I want to go back to Charles White's 3 questions. We did the first 2, but the last one, how do you know who you are? And really, I'd like you to just really try, and the challenge is to do it a brief answer. How do we know who we are? It's really the hugest question, right? But huge existential question. But I think one way, in a really small way to answer it, we can think about your day-to-day and how those things kind of add up and accumulate into who you are, your day-to-day actions. So can you talk just really briefly about what you're working on now and what you've learned in the intervening years between this moment that we're talking about, just a little bit, and how it relates, what you're doing now and how it relates to that moment in the 60s and 70s that we're looking at.
You want me to start? Well, I'm working on my 50-year retrospective, which actually covers my whole 75 years. I think persistence, commitment to wanting to continue what I'm doing, moving the work on, not staying in the same place, and continuing to develop the work for the best quality that I possibly can make.
I think at some point you know what you are supposed to do with your life. And it was a turning point in my life where I was fortunate enough to have multiple skills and forced in a position where I had to decide what I was going to do with it. So the example was I couldn't decide on a major. And so if you look at the three things that were challenging me, it was very difficult because I was enjoying doing the art the most, but most of my units, most of my college credits were in public administration and biology. And so it was very challenging for me to decide what to eliminate. And so as it turns out, becoming a teacher, I was able to integrate all three of those things. I'm at the point now where, having just turned in all these documents for the archive, I'm really relieved because now I don't have to do the chase, of answering questions that are detailed, and you want your answers to be correct. So I've passed that on to the library, and so I'm now back to being an artist and to working with my family, and that's the most important thing.
How do you know who you are, Ian?
I don't know who I am. I think some days I'm Ian White. Some days I'm Charlie White's son. Some days I'm Charles Ian White. Sometimes I'm Mr. White. I teach at a JC. I really enjoy that. Though I'm going to kind of back off on some of my teaching responsibilities and run the gallery there, just because I think I can be effective in that capacity. I'm responsible for, my father has been dead since 1979, and there's not a day that I haven't had to take a phone call or answer a question for that man. And that's really an amazing thing, right? With this kind of retrospective show, I've learned so much more. I've had all these new conversations with this man who's been, just up in the spiritual world for a while. And I've also got to be introduced to all these other kind of beings that were impacted by him on multiple levels. I've seen work that I've never seen before because they want to reintroduce it. There's another cachet attached to it now. There's these amazing stories that are so heartfelt, they really don't even deserve a response. They're just sharing it with you. All that stuff it doesn't get murky. It just kind of fits into the different kind of compartmentalization of my life, so to speak. I have this amazing 8-year-old boy. He's amazing to me, right? He's like the mirror image of me when I was 8, and that's just shocking to me. I don't know why, it shouldn't be, but it is. And the joy of his personal daily discovery is not lost on me whatsoever. And, I'm so blessed to these people who kind of nourished me. And I was also in this family. My parents were individual children. They didn't have siblings. But we would have these family reunions, so to speak, based on years of friendship. And those are really enduring kind of moments. You would leave with more work because everybody was on their game, and everybody is expected to be on their game. And you're sharing information because the coming together of individuals, again, is about really the celebration of what you're doing in life and how you're impacting and all these things that deal with education within the arts. It's really a wonderful time. And to see where we're transitioning into where we're at now, this show at the Charles White Elementary, I'm giving it another plug, it's kind of one of those things. But through those interviews and through kind of this institutional practice of expanding the footprint that's happening a little bit more and potentially speaks that this moment is broadening, this kind of the adoption of Charles White Elementary Gallery from LACMA as a satellite is very significant, and that they're going to expand that and again bring work to individuals' communities that are typically not accustomed to having shows, very similar to the Broad having the Soul of the Nation. These are moments that are transitional on multiple levels, and that the institutions are picking up on this speaks that it's not a fad. It's important, though, that we have more galleries that are owned by women and people of color. That hasn't quite happened yet, and that needs to happen, and that kind of transition needs to happen in terms of economic kind of resources and so forth. But the time today, man, I used to have to go to New York to go see as much as artwork I'm seeing right now, and that's a benefit. I can go here. I can walk across the street, right? That's something else. There's another show at CAM, and I got to give a shout out to CAM because CAM is doing the Plum Line, Charles White and the Contemporaries, and that's very significant too. My father is this cat who was like impacted all these folks. That's an amazing thing to have one person do that, and that's quite. It's celebratory to the extent of, well, we can just keep on going, but it also shows, again, models that are available and how we need to kind of engage in that kind of practice. There's things that are coming up. Former student, this retrospective. If you're in Savannah, you need to get out and see that Suzanne Jackson show.
Well, we hope to
Right.
tour it.
Right. Well, we'll see what happens. Right? David Hammons. It'll be here at Hauser Worth. Please get on out there. That doesn't happen often either, and that's going to happen this next month. There's amazing things that are happening that, as a creative being, being in Los Angeles, where our communities are very diverse in numerous different capacities, it's a good time, and I hope to see a lot of you folks at these venues. You need to get on out there and support this visual community. So,
I think that's a great place to open it up for some questions. All right.
First, I want to start by saying thank you very much for your patronage and your art. I think all of us have benefited from that. My name is Stephen Page. I'm also a 65 baby. I was born in Los Angeles.
that's what I'm talking about, man.
One of the things I love visual arts, also love music. So can you guys talk a little bit about your connection in that group of not just visual artists, but musicians? Because jazz is also a very big part of Los Angeles.
I'm in Savannah, Georgia, but
I'll be there in February, during that time, so I'm come see you.
all right. And Barbara McCullough sitting in the audience. I see her. Barbara was with us doing a Listen Here music group, which is a combination of scientists, visual artists. We bring in music, and when Barbara was there, we introduced music to people in Savannah at Savannah State University, which is an HBCU. The maestro there is Ike Carter. He retired, but he still does the program. We do a music discussion group. The music comes back to California because Barbara brought in, Barbara, who's your film? I forget.
My film is Horace Tapscott
Horace Tapscott, Musical
Musical Griot.
Griot, was in Leimert Park playing, and so was Jack DeJohnette. I remember little boy playing drums with his dad. I forget. He's well known. Anyway, we do the music group, and we tape it on Wednesdays, and we talk about music. Basically, two of us are visual artists, and we make that relationship of the music to the arts. My work, I cannot, everything that I'm doing now has to do with blues, there's an Alice Coltrane piece, Thelonious Monk. So that relationship of the music to the art ever since, and I remember my loft on Jefferson and Maine, at night when we'd all start working, it was the music coming through the air. It's one of the things that I sort of remember about Los Angeles, that late night sound of the music when everybody was working and painting. And also I remember living in San Francisco, not realizing that I was listening to Charles Mingus, to Eric Dolphy, in little clubs. My friend Wilma and I would stick our heads in the doors in the Fillmore when we weren't supposed to even be there, we weren't old enough. So that music, and also having parents coming from St. Louis, bringing the blues across, that migration of people across the country brought blues, brought music that we grew up with from the South, Mississippi Hill Country blues. That came across country with our families. And Los Angeles, as it turns out, my son's grandfather, who was a piano player, his grandmother, a noted violinist here in 1906, U.B. Blake would come and play my piano at my house. And that's hard, you know, this is what Los Angeles was, because we know Los Angeles back in those days for Western Avenue. There was Ike and Tina Turner, there was all kinds of music, you know, supposedly over in the black community. And then along Sunset, there was music in the clubs that I think really filled a lot of us artists, you know, in all the ethnicities, as far as listening to music while we're working. I think that for me, that's an integral part of what I do. And I think it feeds a number of us as artists. How about you? Do you listen to music?
All the time.
I know, you can't
Keeps
help
me
it.
happy.
And as I
Just
mentioned,
keeps
you
me
know,
happy.
Brockman kept Leimert Park jumping, you know, the whole time. So it was a surprise for me to see a big fence around it. It was really strange. That part was open.
And
It is.
Brockman started the jazz festival, the Watts
Yeah.
Jazz Festival, right?
Yes, but yeah, constant. It was just a major cultural exchange. You know, we had West Indian Mardi Gras type parades where floats were built. Caribbean heat.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah.
Caribbean heat. There's a lot going, a lot happening. My voice is dissipating, so I'm going to stop here. I also am aware of the time factor, and I'm not sure how we're doing with
We
time.
need another question.
Maybe, yeah, we'll take one more, couple
There's
more
somebody way
questions.
back there.
Okay.
My name is Chris Carter, I'm an aspiring producer. I'm interested in the connection between, I guess, two-dimensional art form, and I'm trying to produce, I want to do movies. Has anything recently caught your eye as far as black film that, I'm thinking like Moonlight to Black Panther, like in the arts, what you see and what you like now?
My personal feeling is that I went to Art and Practice to see the historic filmmakers from Los Angeles, Haile Garima, Barbara McCullough. Is that still on at Art and
Yep, it's
Practice?
on until September 15th.
I think historically, you should go see those films and sit in the gallery. Then you'll know where the new film comes from. You really need to historically know these filmmakers who, when they didn't want them at UCLA or making film, and I remember that, especially people struggling, you know, as filmmakers, just to be editors, just to get distribution. Part of the Black Expo that we did in San Francisco had a film component where they showed, what's that film, The Nation, what is it? That
Birth of a
racist
Nation.
Birth of a Nation, so people could see what that film was relative to who we were as people. But I think you should go see the Art and Practice exhibition, and that will give you another aspect of how these filmmakers who are working now, what the struggle they've gone through, you know.
There's also, through the UCLA archive, when I forget what that group is called, LA Rebellion Group. There's a series of 10 or 12 artists. So there's research time that you need to dedicate.
Exactly.
You know, you really have to put in the real time for it.
And that,
Y'all like now, like have you seen anything recently that you like?
I'll also just say that the show at Art and Practice has contemporary working artists, younger artists as well. So it's a mix of LA Rebellion era filmmakers and younger filmmakers. So there are some examples of younger filmmakers, though also a lot of the filmmakers of LA Rebellion are working today as well.
As a parent of an 8-year-old whose son was Black Panther this Halloween, and when I was telling the old guard my son's, you know, he's gonna be Black Panther this Halloween, they're like, oh, you're making him awful political awful early. And I was like, wait, no, it's the film. It's the new film. You know, it's not, I mean, there's all different kind of genres that's happening now. And it's amazing that there is this wealth of variety, and that's very important just to mine. But another shameless plug, May 4th at LACMA, we're having a portrait of Charles White, a dramatic presentation by Roger Guevenier Smith and Mark Anthony Thomas, where you have that dramatic and that musical component. And that's going to be at the Bing. I encourage you all to be there. But it is also kind of, again, those kind of relationships and where you're kind of merging these numerous creative entities together. And I think at that point, then whatever it is you're doing becomes even more viable in some kind of capacity.
Thank you very much.
Maybe we have time for one more?
Hi, my name is Liz Gordon. Hi, Dale. How are you? Today we have a really dynamic, collaborative art scene happening, not so much in the great institutions of Los Angeles, which thankfully are all bringing all these people to light, which is really great. And I think Pacific Standard Time has really brought a lot of people also that were forgotten about. What do you think of the contemporary galleries that are here in town today, the young artists that are out there today? Are we doing enough in the gallery scene here to really be able to collaborate all of those different arts that are here and the people that are working here today? And by the way, there's not much difference today having a gallery in terms of having to pay the rent and so on and so forth, and artists being able to sell their work and galleries being able to make enough to really support themselves. So we need a lot more support on that realm as well, just like in the days when you had Brockman Gallery and Gallery 32 and so on. So, but there really is a dynamic force here, and I invite all of you to go out and really check out the local galleries and see what's really happening here in LA. I think that there really is a cross-cultural thing happening, at least in my world there is, and in other galleries here in town. So
I might just give a shout out to, there's a event happening in Grand Park this week, I think. And there's a lot of artists and gallerists that are showing work there. So if you are available to walk down, it's just a few blocks down. You can see some of them kind of all in one place for an afternoon to access some of that, some of what's going on in LA today. There's a lot going on in LA today.
No, there's a whole bunch. I mean, like you're talking about. The fact that you can see people of color in these kind of encyclopedic museums, in these contemporary museums, that's significant. That you can see them in the galleries, numerous galleries, is significant because there's an economic cachet attached to it, because they're in the major institution. I mean, you know, there's also quality work being produced. So there's numerous different reasons why the occurrences. It's about a consistency. Will it happen on a continuous basis? You know, there's so many different African American artists having a show right now, and it's not February. So, you know, that kind of dynamic to where maybe we're at the point where, no, brothers ain't got a show in February. I don't know, you know, but the idea, again, going back to my son, well, when the show happens at MoMA, my boy comes off the escalator into the second floor, and he's greeted by this Charles White mural. He says, Dad, is the whole museum Grandpapa Charles? But just the idea that it could be conceivable is where I'm at, right? And, you know, that place in itself, you know, there's something to be said there. So. It's taken a century, but.
Yeah, a century. I don't say a half a century. It goes all the way back. I just read 1919 when the soldiers came back from World War I, and they were not recognized for their contribution. Every time they come back from battle and they're not recognized in this country for who they are, that still is relative to who, you know, we are as artists in our culture. And we are the only ones who can do anything about that by speaking up, by participating.
Getting out there.
Yeah.
And we have further to go.
Yeah, a long way to go, yeah.
And you as an audience, major audience and participants, can add to this movement that we have that's going. And so I invite you, in closing, to influence the people that you know and to include the young people, right? Because it is about the youth.
Find ways that students can get into talks like this or museums without having to pay. You know, can you help your, you know, legislators or people who have money to get them in? You know, Ian brought a whole class of students
And they
here.
got in free, they got in here free, they got in Mocha free, and I get them into the county museum free.
Yeah, and so
there
if you
is
have
that.
students, make sure that you have a way, because that was the one thing I did, you know, when I was at Watts Towers, taking the kids, or over at 95th Street School, taking them to Watts Towers, they hadn't even been to the other side of the freeway in their neighborhood. In Savannah, taking kids to from Savannah State University to the High Museum or into town. And we live in our own areas and boxes, but we forget that there are some people who don't even leave their neighborhoods, and kids especially. And they are the future of what we do.
There's a lot of galleries in town that really do offer the ability for kids to participate.
Yeah.
And most of them are free. You can go in and do workshops and things like that. And there's also craft and folk art, or now contemporary craft, that offer free.
Sometimes people in the neighborhoods don't know that. And so it's getting information to their families and their teachers so that they know that those things are available and free. I think that's where we miss out in communication.
And do look out for the Riddle exhibit that's coming to the new name
The Craft
Craft
Museum.
Museum.
Yeah.
Yeah, it'll be significant.
That opens next month, John Riddle.
It's coming sooner,
Next month, yeah.
next month.
Yeah.
All right, so thank you all for coming.